The year of our Lord 1878 was etched into the land with sun and wind. In this corner of Colorado, the world seemed stripped down to its bones. The sun was a merciless god in a bleached-out, endless sky, baking the earth until it cracked like old leather. Red dust, fine as flour, was the country's lifeblood and its curse. It rose in ghostly plumes behind every plodding hoof, settled in the creases of a man's eyes, and colored the very air he breathed. It was a land of harsh truths, where water was a prayer and shade a fleeting miracle. Great herds of longhorns, rivers of bone and hide, flowed across the plains, their passage a slow, thundering pulse against the silence. They moved through landscapes of parched grass and stubborn sagebrush, their mournful lowing the only music for miles. The wind was the true master here. It was a restless spirit that never slept, howling through the stark, lonely canyons and whispering secrets across the treeless hills. It stripped the warmth from a man in winter and offered no relief in the blistering heat of summer. A constant, abrasive reminder of how small a soul could feel in such a vast, empty church, on a stretch of land that was his and his alone. Wyatt Thompson moved with the sun. He was a man in his early 30s, built tall and broad like the cottonwoods that grew sparingly by the creek bed. His face was a map of the land itself, weathered by the elements, with the lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the unforgiving glare. A thick, dark mustache covered a mouth that rarely smiled. A silence clung to him like his own shadow, a heavy blanket woven from loss and solitude. 5 years. It had been 5 years since the world had ended. Not the whole world, just a small cabin, the smell of baking bread, the sound of his wife Sarah's laughter, the feel of his 4-year-old son, Thomas, clinging to his leg. It had all been erased in a single night of senseless violence. Riders passing through, drunk on whiskey and greed. They took the little money he had, but they also took everything that mattered. He'd buried Sarah and Thomas side by side on the small rise behind the house, beneath a lone, defiant pine. Since then, the silence in the cabin had been absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the groan of the floorboards under his solitary weight. He worked from before dawn until long after dusk, pouring his grief into the soil. He mended fences that stretched to the horizon, branded calves that bawled in protest, and broke wild horses whose spirits were as untamed as the land. His hands were calloused and scarred, his body a testament to relentless labor. Work was his penance and his salvation. It left him too exhausted to dream. But loneliness was a persistent weed. In the nearby town of Redemption, a name that felt like a cruel joke, he was an object of pity. The women would watch him pass, their faces softening with a sad, clucking sympathy. "Poor Mr. Thompson," they'd whisper behind their hands. "Such a tragedy. A good man like that, all alone." The men would clap him on the shoulder, their heartiness forced and awkward. "Anything you need, Wyatt, you just say the word." But he never did. Their pity was a heavier burden than his sorrow. It was a constant, public reminder of the hole in his life, a wound they insisted on prodding with their well-meaning kindness. It was the pity that finally broke him. He couldn't bear another Sunday service where the preacher's eyes lingered on him with mournful significance. Another trip to the general store where Mrs. Gable pressed a jar of preserves into his hand with a trembling lip. He didn't want their sorrow. He just wanted the emptiness to be quieter. And so, he did what other lonely men in this vast country did. He sat down at his rough-hewn table with a pen and a sheet of paper, the light of a kerosene lamp casting long shadows on the wall. He wrote a letter not to a friend or family, for he had none close by, but to an agency in the East. He was ordering a bride. The words were plain, unadorned. A business transaction. He described his ranch. 160 acres, a sturdy cabin, a good well, a small herd. He described himself, 32 years old, healthy, hard-working, a widower. He did not speak of love, for he believed that part of him was buried on the hill. He wrote of needing a partner, a helpmate, someone to share the work and the silence, someone to fill the space that echoed with ghosts. He sealed the envelope, a strange mix of shame and desperate hope churning in his gut, and sent it off on the next stagecoach. 3 months later, she arrived. Her name was Clara Maeve Donovan, and she stepped off the train from New York, looking as delicate and out of place as a porcelain doll in a blacksmith's shop. She was 23, with hair the color of burnished copper tied back in a severe bun that couldn't quite contain the rebellious curls around her face. Her eyes were a deep, wary green, and her skin was pale, untouched by the western sun. She clutched a single battered carpetbag to her chest as if it were a shield. Wyatt, standing on the dusty platform, felt a jolt of something he hadn't felt in years. She was prettier than the faded photograph she had sent, but it was her fragility that struck him most. She looked as though the first gust of Colorado wind might spirit her away. He stepped forward, his own size and roughness suddenly feeling clumsy and brutish. "Miss Donovan?" His voice was raspy from disuse. She startled, her eyes widening. "Mr. Thompson." Her voice was soft, cultured, a world away from the gruff tones of the West. The wagon ride to the ranch was a study in silence. Clara sat ramrod straight on the hard wooden seat, her gaze fixed on the alien landscape. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. The sky was an immense, oppressive lid on a world of brown and gray. The mountains on the horizon were like jagged teeth. There was none of the gentle, green familiarity of the East. This land was raw, powerful, and utterly indifferent to her presence. She felt small and profoundly lost. Wyatt, for his part, didn't know what to say. He pointed out landmarks in terse phrases. "That's Pike's Peak. The creek runs through there." He was used to the quiet, but this was a different kind of quiet, one filled with her unspoken fear and his own crippling awkwardness. Life on the ranch was a brutal education for Clara. Her hands, accustomed to needlepoint and the cool ivory of piano keys, were soon raw and blistered. The milk cow, Daisy, seemed to take a personal dislike to her, swatting her in the face with a manure-caked tail. The wood-burning stove was a temperamental beast that either billowed smoke or refused to light. Mending Wyatt's thick denim trousers was a battle against stubborn fabric, and mucking out the stalls was a trial of stomach and spirit that left her gagging. She fell into bed each night with an ache in every bone, the scent of hay and dust clinging to her hair, wondering if she had made the most terrible mistake of her life. Yet, she did not complain. There was a core of surprising resilience within her slender frame. Each morning, she rose with the sun, pulled on the simple, practical dress she'd bought, and faced the day's labors. She learned, slowly. She learned the rhythm of kneading dough until it was smooth, the precise heat needed to fry bacon without burning it, the steady, rhythmic pull that would coax milk from Daisy's udders. She found a strange satisfaction in the exhaustion, in the tangible results of her work. In the evenings, they would sometimes sit on the porch as the sun bled across the sky, painting it in violent shades of orange and purple. The silence between them began to change. It was less of a void and more of a shared space. He might point out a hawk circling high above, and she might tell him about the ships she used to watch on the Hudson River. They were small, hesitant offerings, bridges being built across a chasm of different experiences. Wyatt found himself watching her. He saw the determination in the set of her jaw as she scrubbed the floor, the flicker of wonder in her eyes as she watched a sunset for the first time. A part of him that he thought was dead began to stir, a faint, tentative warmth in the cold landscape of his heart. But they were not entirely alone in this vast emptiness. On the neighboring ranch, a half-mile to the east, lived May Blackwood. May was a widow, 28 years old, and a woman forged in the crucible of the West. She had come here with her husband 5 years prior, full of the same dreams that had animated so many others. But the land took without mercy. It had taken her husband in a pointless bar fight over a card game, and it had taken her infant son during a winter so brutal the snow had buried their cabin up to the eaves. The doctor couldn't get through, and the town of Redemption had offered prayers but no practical help. May had buried her child herself, her grief a frozen, solitary thing. The town treated May differently than they treated Wyatt. Where he received pity, she received suspicion. She was too beautiful, they whispered, with her wild mane of jet-black hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. She was too independent, running her small ranch with a fierce competence that unnerved the men and drew the ire of the women. They saw her sorrow not as a tragedy, but as a dangerous, untamed darkness. May had known Wyatt for years, a fellow inhabitant of grief's lonely island. They rarely spoke, but there was a silent understanding between them. A year ago, his stallion had thrown him, breaking his leg badly. He'd been lying in the dirt, miles from his cabin, when May had found him while out hunting. Without a word, she had managed to get him onto her own horse, her strength surprising, and had taken him back to his cabin. She had set the bone with practiced hands, her touch firm and gentle, and had stayed for 3 days, tending to him, cooking his meals, and keeping the fire lit until he was steady enough to manage on his own. In those 3 days, a connection had been forged in the shared language of pain and survival. When she left, neither of them spoke of it, but something had passed between them, a quiet recognition, a current of unspoken intensity. Since then, May had watched him from afar. She saw the deepening of the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped with weariness. She understood his solitude because it was a mirror of her own. When she saw the wagon returning from town with a woman sitting beside him, a pale, fragile-looking woman from the east, a sharp, unwelcome pang struck her heart. She had known he was seeking a wife. The whole county knew. But seeing it, seeing her, was like a door slamming shut on a possibility she hadn't even allowed herself to name. The first meeting of the three was an accident of geography. Clara, struggling to haul 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, lost her footing. Water sloshed over the side, turning the red dust at her feet to a dark, slick mud. A curse, soft and unladylike, escaped her lips. "Let me help you with that." Clara looked up. Startled, a woman was standing there, having approached on silent, moccasined feet. It was the neighbor, May Blackwood, up close. She was even more striking, taller than Clara, with a lean, strong body clad in practical buckskin trousers and a simple shirt. Her dark hair was in a long, loose braid, and her gaze was direct, unsettling. "Thank you," Clara stammered, flustered, as May took one of the buckets with an ease that made Clara feel weak and clumsy. Just then, Wyatt emerged from the barn. He stopped short when he saw the 2 women. A strange tension immediately filled the air, thick and palpable. "May," he said. His voice was different, softer but also strained. "Wyatt," she nodded, her eyes holding his for a fraction of a second too long. "Your bride seems to be finding her footing." There was no malice in her tone, just a plain statement of fact, but to Clara, it felt like a judgment. "She's learning," Wyatt said, his gaze shifting to Clara, then to the ground. "Clara, this is our neighbor, May Blackwood." "We've met," Clara said quietly. May handed the bucket to Wyatt. Her fingers brushed his, a fleeting contact that seemed to crackle in the dry air. "I'll leave you to it," she said, and with another nod, she turned and walked away, her stride long and confident. Clara watched her go, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She looked at Wyatt, but he was staring after May, his expression unreadable, a mask of stone. The silence that fell between them now was not the comfortable silence of the porch. It was heavy, awkward, filled with the presence of the woman who had just left. In the days that followed, Clara became acutely aware of May Blackwood. She would catch glimpses of her in the distance, riding her horse along the ridge, a solitary, powerful figure against the sky. Sometimes, when she and Wyatt were mending the fence that separated their properties, May would be on the other side, doing the same. The encounters were brief, punctuated by clipped greetings, but Clara felt May's eyes on them. It was a watchful, knowing gaze that seemed to see right through Wyatt's stoic facade. And when May looked at Wyatt, Clara saw a flicker of something raw and deeply buried, a longing that was as stark and real as the mountains themselves. She was a constant, unsettling presence on the edge of their new life. A ghost from a past Clara didn't know, casting a long shadow over a future she was desperately trying to build. The passing of days in the West was not marked by the turning of pages in a calendar, but by the slow, inexorable shift of the sun across the vast sky. Weeks bled into months, and the raw, alien landscape began to etch itself onto Clara's soul, just as the hard work was callousing her hands. The girl who had stepped off the train from New York was beginning to fade, replaced by a woman who knew the heft of an axe, the ache of a well-pulled bucket, and the particular smell of rain on dry earth. Her body was a tapestry of small pains, a purple bruise on her hip from a cantankerous gait, a long scratch on her forearm from a thorny bush, the permanent grit of dust under her fingernails. Yet, with this physical hardening came a strange and unexpected softening elsewhere. The vast, intimidating silence of the ranch was no longer a void to be feared, but a canvas on which small sounds became significant. The gentle lowing of the cattle at dusk, the creak of the porch swing, the steady, rhythmic breathing of Wyatt sleeping in the room next to hers. The porch became their sanctuary. In the cool of the evening, after the last chore was done and the dishes were washed, they would sit in the two weathered rocking chairs, separated by a few feet of empty space that felt, with each passing night, a little less wide. Their conversations were like a slow-growing vine, starting with tentative shoots, comments on the weather, the price of feed in town, a coyote's howl in the distance. One evening, as Wyatt was mending a bridle, the leather dark and supple in his large hands, Clara was darning one of his socks, the needle a small silver fish darting in and out of the thick wool. "You're good with a needle," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't startle her anymore. "My mother insisted upon it," Clara replied, a faint smile touching her lips. She said a woman's worth could be judged by the quality of her stitches. She would be appalled by the state of my hands now. She held them up for a moment in the fading light, the palms red and rough. Wyatt looked at her hands, then back at her face. "Sarah, my wife, she hated sewing. She'd sooner break a wild colt than thread a needle. Said it was like trying to cage a hummingbird." It was the first time he had spoken her name. It hung in the air between them. Not a ghost, but a memory given weight and substance. Clara's hands stilled in her lap. She didn't offer empty platitudes or hurried condolences. She simply waited, giving the name the respect of her silence. "She planted those morning glories," Wyatt said after a long moment, gesturing with his chin toward the trellis by the porch steps, where a few stubborn flowers still clung to the vines. Said a house wasn't a home without something pretty to look at. He fell silent again, his focus returning to the bridle in his hands, but his movements were slower, more deliberate, as if he were handling something fragile. He began to share more after that, in small, broken pieces offered up like precious, painful artifacts. He told her about Thomas, his son, who had his mother's bright laugh and a fearless love for horses. He spoke of the night they were taken, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else. It was the only way he could speak of it at all. He built a wall of detachment around the memory, and Clara understood that he was allowing her to see the wall, but not what lay behind it. He was opening a door, but only a crack. He was terrified of letting the cold back in, of giving loss another chance to take root in his life. He was kind to her, gentle even, but his kindness was wrapped in caution. He treated her like a welcome guest in his home, but not yet the mistress of his heart. While this fragile new life was taking shape at Wyatt's ranch, May Blackwood continued her solitary existence. Her life was a stark contrast of external scorn and internal strength. In redemption, she was a pariah. The women saw her beauty as a weapon and her widowhood as an opportunity for sin. They crossed the street to avoid her, their whispers following her like biting flies. That Blackwood woman, no good will come of her living out there alone. The men looked at her with a different kind of speculation, a crude mixture of desire and disdain. They saw a woman without a man to protect her, a prize to be claimed or a danger to be tamed. May endured it all with a bitter, fortified grace. She knew the wilderness of the human heart was far more dangerous than the one of land and sky. She had learned that lesson when her husband, a good man with a quick temper, was shot dead over a hand of cards, and the sheriff had called it a fair fight. Law of the jungle, they'd said. She'd learned it again in the depths of the great blizzard, when she had held her feverish son, Daniel, for 3 days, praying for the thaw that came too late. The town's pity then had been a thin, useless blanket against the ice in her soul. Now, their contempt was just another hardship to be endured, like drought or hail. Her grief was not a soft, pitiable thing. It was a hard, sharp-edged stone she carried inside her, a constant reminder of what the world could take. The summer gave way to the unpredictable temperament of autumn. One afternoon, the sky, which had been a placid blue, turned a violent, bruised purple in the space of an hour. The wind began to rise, not as a whisper, but as a low, mournful howl that promised fury. Wyatt had ridden out to check on a section of fence miles away. "A storm's coming," he'd said before he left. "A bad one. Stay inside. Latch the barn door tight." Clara had done as she was told, but as the first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to spatter against the window panes, she saw one of the new calves, barely a month old, wander out of the barn and head toward the open pasture, spooked by the rising wind. Panic seized her. The calf was small, and Wyatt valued his stock. In a moment of impulsive determination, wanting to prove her worth, to show she was more than a fragile Easterner, she ignored his warning. She pulled on a heavy coat, cinched her hat, and ran to the stable. The horse, an old, steady mare named Bess, was nervous, her eyes wide in the gloom. Clara managed to saddle her, her fingers fumbling with the cold. Stiff leather. Out in the open. The storm hit with full force. The wind tore at her clothes, and the rain came down in a blinding, horizontal sheet, turning the world to a gray, swirling chaos. She found the calf huddled against a rock outcropping and managed to turn it back toward the barn. It was on the way back, blinded by a sudden gust of wind and rain, that Bess slipped in the slick, red mud. The world tilted violently. Clara was thrown, landing hard on her side with a cry of pain that was stolen by the wind. She tried to get up, but a searing agony shot through her left ankle. It was trapped, wedged beneath the fallen horse. Bess struggled, her heavy body pinning Clara's leg to the ground, the mud sucking at them both like quicksand. Fear, cold and absolute, washed over her. The rain plastered her hair to her face, and the world was nothing but the howling wind, the smell of wet earth, and the crushing weight on her leg. She might have screamed. She wasn't sure. Time seemed to dissolve. Then, through the gray curtain of rain, a figure emerged, moving with a purpose that seemed to defy the storm. It was May Blackwood. She was on foot, her black hair plastered to her skull, her face a mask of grim concentration. She carried a rifle in one hand. May didn't waste time with questions. She assessed the situation in a single, sweeping glance. "Don't move!" she yelled over the wind. She approached the terrified horse, speaking to it in a low, calming voice that was somehow audible beneath the storm's roar. Bess, seeming to recognize a confident hand, quieted. May laid down her rifle, then put her shoulder to the horse's flank. "When I push, you pull your leg free," she commanded. Clara nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain. May set her feet, her muscles straining, and pushed with all her might. The horse shifted, groaning, and for a heart-stopping second, the pressure on Clara's ankle intensified. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, Clara yanked her leg. It came free with a sickening squelch of mud. May didn't stop. She cajoled and pushed the mare until the animal struggled back to its feet, trembling but unharmed. Then she turned to Clara. She knelt in the mud, her hands surprisingly gentle as they probed the injured ankle. "It's not broken," she said, her voice firm and reassuring, "but badly sprained. Can you stand?" Clara tried, but collapsed back with a sharp cry. Without another word, May looped Clara's arm over her own strong shoulders. "Lean on me," half carrying, half dragging her. May got Clara through the mud and the driving rain, back to the relative safety of Wyatt's cabin. She kicked open the door, helped Clara to a chair, and immediately set about building up the fire in the hearth. From that day on, something shifted between the two women. The awkward tension was replaced by a strange, unspoken bond forged in mud and crisis. A few days later, her ankle tightly wrapped and propped on a stool, Clara saw May riding past and, on impulse, called out to her. May reined in her horse and, after a moment's hesitation, dismounted and walked to the porch. Clara offered her a cup of coffee, and May accepted. They sat in the same rocking chairs where Clara sat with Wyatt, the silence between them different now, inquisitive rather than hostile. "I never properly thanked you," Clara began. "You saved my life." May shrugged, cradling the warm mug in her hands. "The West demands you look out for your neighbors, even the foolish ones who ride out in a storm." The words were blunt, but her eyes held no judgment, only a weary understanding. It was the first of many conversations. Clara, lonely for female companionship, found herself drawn to this solitary, guarded woman. She told May about her life in New York, a world of cobblestone streets, crowded drawing rooms, and strict social rules, a world where she had felt as trapped and useless as a bird in a gilded cage. In return, May shared pieces of her own story. She spoke of the hope she'd had when she first came west, the dream of building something that was truly theirs. She talked about the son she had lost, not with the tearful sentimentality Clara might have expected, but with a quiet, aching sorrow that was far more profound. "He was a fighter," May said, staring out at the horizon. "He had my husband's spirit, but you can't fight a fever. You can't fight a winter that won't end." Through these talks, sitting on the porch or mending fences side by side, Clara began to see the woman beneath the town's cruel rumors. She saw a woman hollowed out by loss but not broken by it, and in seeing May's pain, she began to understand something else. She saw the way May's eyes would drift toward Wyatt's barn whenever she spoke of her own struggles, the way she would mention his name with a careful casualness that betrayed a deep and constant awareness of him. Clara realized it with a quiet, sinking certainty one afternoon. They were talking about loneliness. "Sometimes the quiet is the loudest thing in the world," Clara confessed, thinking of the long nights in the cabin. "I know," May said softly. "It has a voice. It tells you everything you've lost." Her gaze had drifted across the pasture, settling on Wyatt, who was in the distance, breaking a new horse in the corral. The look on her face was stripped bare of all defenses. It was a look of profound, hopeless love, a love that had grown in the silent, fallow ground of shared tragedy, a love that knew it had nowhere to go. Clara's heart constricted. It wasn't jealousy she felt, not at first. It was a deep, aching sadness for this woman, and for Wyatt, and for herself. The suspicion, once planted, took root. She started noticing the small things, the way Wyatt would pause in his work when he saw May riding in the distance, the shared, fleeting glances across the fence line that held entire conversations. There was an invisible thread connecting them, woven from a past she was not part of, a shared grief she could not fully comprehend. One night, unable to sleep, Clara rose from her bed and went to the window. The moon was a silver dollar in a black velvet sky, illuminating the landscape in a ghostly light, and then she saw them. They were standing by the fence that marked the boundary between their lands. They weren't touching. They weren't even speaking. They stood a few feet apart, two dark silhouettes against the pale grass, both staring out at the distant, sleeping mountains. Wyatt had his hat in his hands, and May's arms were crossed over her chest. The space between them was charged with everything they could not say. It was an intimacy of silence, a communion of shared burdens, in their stillness. Clara saw a story of what might have been, a profound and unshakable connection that her presence had interrupted. Wyatt turned his head slightly, and his eyes met May's, even from the window. Clara could feel the weight of that look, a look of deep longing, of shared history, and of profound, heartbreaking restraint. She stepped back from the window, a cold sickness coiling in her stomach. The warmth she had begun to feel in this house, the fragile hope she had nurtured, suddenly felt like a lie. In that moment, she was the outsider, the stranger who had stumbled into a story that had begun long before she arrived. The doubt and hurt were quickly followed by the hot, sharp sting of jealousy. This land was supposed to be a place of simple truths, of hard work and clear boundaries. But she was trapped now, in a tangle of emotions she couldn't name, in a triangle of hearts where love had no simple answers, only complex, painful questions. The image Clara had seen from her window, of Wyatt and May standing as silent sentinels at the edge of their lands, burned itself into her memory. It became a lens through which she now viewed everything. The quiet moments on the porch were no longer filled with burgeoning warmth, but with unspoken questions. The space between their rocking chairs seemed to have widened into a canyon. She tried to breach the silence, to map the unknown territory of his past. One evening, while they were shelling peas, the rhythmic thump of the pods dropping into the tin bowl the only sound between them, she found her courage. "Wyatt," she began, her voice small. "You've told me about Sarah, about your son, but you've never spoken much of the time since." He didn't look up from his work, his large thumbs expertly splitting a pod. "Not much to tell, just work." "You've known May for all that time?" she pressed gently. His hands stilled for a fraction of a second. "She's a neighbor." The words were flat, definitive, a stone wall erected in the middle of the conversation. "She seems to have had a difficult time of it as well." Clara persisted, feeling her way through a dark room. "The West is difficult for everyone," he said, and the finality in his tone was unmistakable. The wall was now fortified. He stood up, taking the bowl of empty pods. "I'll feed these to the pigs." He walked away, leaving Clara with a bowl of perfect green peas and the cold, hard certainty that a part of his life, a significant part, was a locked room to which she would not be given a key. His evasiveness was more damning than any confession. The opportunity for the town of Redemption to pass its judgment came a few weeks later, at the annual harvest social held in the dusty square outside the church. It was Clara's formal introduction to the community as Mrs. Thompson. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue cotton, and clung to Wyatt's arm, feeling as scrutinized as a new breed of livestock at auction. Wyatt was stiff and uncomfortable, nodding curtly to the men and avoiding the pitying glances of the women. Clara was soon separated from him and found herself adrift in a sea of calico and judgment, presided over by the town's matriarchs. Mrs. Thompson." A woman named Agnes Miller greeted her, her smile as thin as a thread. "A pleasure to finally meet you. It all happened so swiftly. One hardly had time to prepare a welcome." The implication was clear. Her arrival was an unseemly rush to the altar. "The mail moves faster than gossip sometimes. Mrs. Miller," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Another woman, Martha Gable, whose husband ran the general store, chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. It's a blessing, of course. A man like Mr. Thompson shouldn't be alone. But a mail-order bride, well, it's a gamble, isn't it? For both parties. Clara felt her cheeks flush. I consider myself very fortunate. Of course you do, dear, Agnes said, patting her arm with a condescending touch. A fine ranch, a respectable man, and so conveniently located right next to, well, you must be a brave woman, living so close to that May Blackwood. A widow's grief can curdle. You know, it can make a woman reckless. The circle of women tightened, their eyes sharp and hungry. They were not speaking to her, but through her, using her as a vessel for their long-held venom toward May. They spoke of May's unnatural beauty, her unwomanly habit of wearing trousers, and the strange circumstances of her husband's death. They say she feels no shame, Martha whispered, leaning in conspiratorially. Walks into town with her head held high, looking every man in the eye. It isn't decent. Clara felt suffocated, cornered by their sanctimonious cruelty. She was about to turn and flee when a calm, low voice cut through their chatter. Are you ladies discussing the quality of my fences, or is there another reason my name is on your tongues? May Blackwood stood behind them. She hadn't dressed for the social, but was in her usual practical attire. Having come to town for supplies, she held a burlap sack in one hand, and her expression was one of cool, weary contempt. The circle of women broke apart, their faces a mixture of shock and guilt. We were just welcoming Mrs. Thompson, Agnes stammered, recovering first. It sounded more like you were poisoning her well, May said, her gaze sweeping over them. She then looked directly at Clara, and her eyes softened with something that looked like an apology. Don't let them trouble you. Their tongues are the sharpest things in this town, and they use them to cut down anything that grows taller than they do. Agnes puffed up with indignation. Well, I never. We are respectable, church-going women. We are not the ones who flaunt ourselves and cast looks at other women's husbands. The accusation hung in the air, aimed at May but meant to wound Clara. May's face hardened, but before she could retort, Clara spoke. May was the one who pulled me from under a horse in a thunderstorm, Clara said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. That doesn't sound like the act of a troublesome woman. It sounds like the act of a good neighbor. A shocked silence fell over the group. May looked at Clara, a flicker of surprise and gratitude in her stormy eyes. But the damage was done. The scene had drawn attention, and now the narrative was set. The quiet new bride, defended by the town pariah, who was now being accused of seducing her husband. The women retreated, victorious, leaving Clara and May standing in the wreckage of their public humiliation. The fallout came later that night. Wyatt had heard the whispers, seen the looks. He was quiet and withdrawn on the ride home, his jaw set like granite. He dropped Clara at the cabin and, without a word, turned the wagon around and headed back toward town. Clara knew where he was going, the saloon. She waited for hours, the food on the table growing cold. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, heavy with dread. It was nearly midnight when he returned. He stumbled through the door, the reek of whiskey preceding him. There was a dark bruise swelling under his eye, and his knuckles were split and bloody. Wyatt, what happened? She cried, rushing to his side. He brushed past her, slumping into a chair. Nothing, he grunted. But the story reached her the next day, delivered by the mail rider who was only too happy to share the town's biggest news. A cowboy named Jedediah Stone, drunk and loud, had started talking about the two women of the Thompson ranch. He'd made a crude joke, something about Wyatt needing a spare in case the new one broke. But his worst venom was saved for May. He called her a name, a foul, ugly word that branded her as a woman of loose morals, a black widow who lured men to their doom. And Wyatt, who had endured 5 years of pity and silence, had finally exploded. He had launched himself at Jedediah, and the ensuing brawl had wrecked half the saloon before the sheriff broke it up. Clara heard the story, and a piece of her heart cracked. He hadn't fought for her. He hadn't defended the honor of his new bride. He had gone to war for May. The fight wasn't a defense of his property. It was the desperate, furious roar of a man whose most sacred wound had been touched. It was the proof she had dreaded, laid bare for the whole town to see. His heart was not hers. It had never been hers to claim. A week later, a storm rolled in, a mirror of the turmoil inside her. The rain fell in relentless, weeping sheets, turning the world outside the windows into a gray blur. Wyatt was out in the barn, his temper as dark as the clouds. Clara sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, letting the cold spray mist her face. The tears she had been holding back for days finally came, silent and hot, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She was crying for the hope she had lost, for the foolishness of her own heart, and for the vast, unbridgeable distance between herself and the man in the barn. She didn't hear the footsteps until a figure stood before her. It was May, soaked to the bone, her black hair hanging in wet ropes. She said nothing, simply stood there for a moment, her presence a strange comfort in the storm. Then she held something out to Clara. It was a man's handkerchief, made of fine, soft linen, yellowed with age. In one corner, embroidered with faded blue thread, was a single, elegant hymn. "His mother's," May said, her voice barely a whisper above the rain. "Eleanor Thompson. He told me it was the only thing of hers he had left." Clara stared at the small square of cloth in her palm. It felt impossibly heavy. Why are you giving this to me?" May's eyes were filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "He gave it to me, the day I left, after his leg was mended. It was a thank you. But it was more than that. We both knew it. It was a promise of something he couldn't give and I shouldn't take." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "It doesn't belong with me. It belongs in this house, with his wife." It was a peace offering, an abdication, a confession. May was handing Clara the proof of her own heartbreak, a relic of an intimacy Clara had never known. May squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity from one wounded woman to another. And then she melted back into the rain, leaving Clara alone with the ghost of Wyatt's mother and the undeniable truth of his heart. When Wyatt came in from the barn, shaking the rain from his hat, he found her waiting at the table. The handkerchief was laid out between them, the faded blue E a stark accusation. He stopped, his eyes fixing on it, all the color drained from his face. "She gave this to you." It wasn't a question. "She said it belongs here." Clara's voice was hollow. "Did you love her, Wyatt?" He sank into the chair opposite her, the exhaustion of years seeming to settle on his shoulders. He stared at the handkerchief, not at her. "Love is a word from another life." "Clara, I don't know it anymore." "Then what is she to you?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Why did you fight for her? Why would you give her this, the only thing you had of your mother's?" He finally looked up, and his eyes were full of a torment that stole her anger, leaving only a deep, shared ache. "Because she's the only one who knows," he said, his voice raw. "She knows what it's like to put your own child in the ground. She knows the silence. When I look at her, I don't have to explain the emptiness. She already lives there." He took a ragged breath. "I'm not the man Sarah married. That man died with her. I'm just what's left. I needed peace. I thought having a wife, a home again. I thought it would make the ghosts quiet. I never meant to be cruel to you. I swear I didn't." "But you thought of her," Clara whispered, the final, devastating question. "Even after I came." He didn't have to answer. The shame and misery on his face were answer enough. He couldn't deny it. He wouldn't lie. Something inside Clara shattered. It wasn't just the hope of love, but the hope of peace, of building a life, even a quiet one. On this harsh land, it was all built on a foundation of ghosts and unspoken feelings for another woman. She stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. She couldn't breathe. The cabin, her home, suddenly felt like a cage. Without a word, she turned and ran. Out the door, into the cold, driving rain, into the dark. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. She stumbled blindly, the mud sucking at her shoes, the rain washing away her tears, until she found herself at the barn. She collapsed onto a pile of clean hay in an empty stall, the scent of earth and animals surrounding her, and she finally let go, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her soul. She lay there for how long? She didn't know. The storm outside raged, a symphony to her own despair. Then, a soft light filled the doorway. May stood there, holding a lantern, her face pale in its flickering glow. She walked over and knelt in the hay beside Clara. She didn't speak. She simply took off her own dry cloak and draped it over Clara's shivering shoulders. And then, in the quiet of the barn, surrounded by the gentle sounds of sleeping animals, the two women wept. They cried for the men they had lost and the children they had buried. They cried for the love they yearned for and the peace that eluded them. They cried for the man they both, in their own complicated ways, loved. Their tears mingled with the rain and the earth, a shared, bitter sacrament of pain, desire, and a profound, desperate loneliness that bound them together more tightly than any rivalry ever could. The night in the barn did not wash away the truth. It merely saturated it, making it heavier. When dawn broke, pale and gray through the barn's dusty planks, Clara returned to the cabin. Wyatt was sitting at the table, a mug of cold coffee untouched before him. He looked up as she entered, his face a haggard mask of sleeplessness and shame. He had not come for her. He had left her to the storm and her sorrow. "Clara," he began, his voice a low rasp. She held up a hand, not in anger, but in a gesture of profound weariness. "There is nothing to say, Wyatt." She did not leave the ranch. To leave would be to admit defeat, to crawl back to an east that had no place for her. This land, harsh as it was the only thing she had. So she stayed. But the tentative bridge that had been forming between them collapsed into dust. A new set of rules, unspoken but rigid, governed their existence. They were two people living under one roof, orbiting a sun of shared grief that was not their own. They ate their meals in a silence thick with unspoken words. They performed their chores with a detached, functional efficiency, moving around each other with the careful choreography of strangers. Clara took over the cabin completely, her presence making it immaculate and orderly. Yet it felt colder than ever before. She slept in her small room, the door firmly closed, and she would hear him. Late at night, pacing the main room like a caged animal before he finally retreated to his own bed. The physical space between them was a manifestation of the emotional chasm that now seemed impossible to cross. He had given her his name, his home, but his heart remained a locked territory, its borders guarded by the ghost of one woman and the living presence of another. This fragile, cold peace was shattered by fire. It began late one night, with a dry lightning storm that rolled across the plains without a drop of rain. A single, errant bolt struck the roof of the barn. At first, there was only the smell, a sharp, acrid scent of ozone and burning hay that cut through the night air. It was Clara who smelled it first, waking from a restless sleep. She looked out her window and saw a faint, hellish orange glow flickering from the barn. "Wyatt!" Her scream tore through the silent house. "The barn!" He was out of his room in an instant, pulling on his boots, his face grim in the moonlight. By the time they reached it, the fire had taken hold, licking its way up the dry timber walls. The crackle of the flames a hungry, monstrous sound. The terrified screams of the horses trapped inside were a sound of pure agony. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He grabbed an axe and began hacking at the large bar across the main door, which had somehow jammed. "Get water!" he roared at Clara over the din. She ran to the well, her hands raw and clumsy on the rope as she hauled up bucket after bucket, her nightgown soaked, her heart pounding with a terror that was cold and sharp. The heat was immense, a physical blow that pushed her back. Just as Wyatt smashed the bar free and began pulling the panicked horses out into the night, another figure appeared, running from the direction of the neighboring ranch. It was May, her face stark and determined in the firelight, her long black hair flying behind her. She had seen the glow against the sky. Without a word, she grabbed a bucket from Clara and joined the desperate fight, her movements strong and sure. Together, the three of them battled the blaze. Wyatt, his face black with soot, disappeared into the choking smoke to free the last of the calves, while May and Clara formed a frantic, desperate line, throwing bucket after bucket of water onto the flames. The smoke was a living thing, clawing at their lungs, blinding them. They worked until their arms felt like lead, until their throats were raw, until the fire, finally denied its feast of dry wood, began to sullenly retreat, leaving behind the smoldering, skeletal remains of the barn. They stood in the aftermath, three soot-stained figures in the eerie pre-dawn light, gasping for breath amidst the ruins. The immediate danger was over, and it was then that May swayed on her feet. A racking cough seized her, and her face, already pale beneath the grime, turned ashen. "May?" Wyatt took a step toward her, his voice rough with concern. She shook her head, trying to wave him off, but her legs gave way. She crumpled to the ground in a heap of exhaustion and sudden, violent illness. She had been running on pure adrenaline, but the smoke, the exertion, and the deep, abiding weariness of her own life had finally caught up to her. Wyatt swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Her head lolled against his chest, and Clara could see that she was burning with fever, her skin flushed, her breathing shallow and ragged. He carried her not toward her own ranch, but toward his cabin, toward their home. He laid her gently on his own bed, the bed he had once shared with Sarah, the bed Clara had never been invited into. A different kind of vigil began. The fire outside was extinguished, but a fever fire now raged within May. Wyatt did not leave her side. Clara became a spectator in her own home, watching a scene of such raw, unguarded intimacy that it felt like a violation to witness it. She watched as Wyatt bathed May's face and throat with a cool, damp cloth. His large, calloused hands that could break a horse or mend a fence, were impossibly gentle as they brushed the damp hair from her forehead. He coaxed sips of water between her cracked lips, whispering her name in a low, pleading tone, a tone Clara had never heard him use. He was not just tending to a sick neighbor. He was fighting a personal war against the loss that had defined his life. He would not let the West take another person from him. Clara moved like a ghost through the cabin. She brought him broth, which he accepted without looking at her. She brought fresh water and clean cloths. She was a servant to his devotion. The jealousy she had felt before was burned away, leaving behind something purer and far more painful, a profound and shattering sorrow. She was not watching a rival being tended to by her husband. She was watching a man desperately try to save a piece of his own soul. All through the night, he sat by the bed. Sometimes he would just hold May's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles, his gaze fixed on her face as if he could will her back to health through the sheer force of his concentration. In the flickering lamplight, his face was stripped of its stoic mask. Every line was a testament to his fear, his desperation. His eyes, when they looked at the unconscious woman in his bed, held a lifetime of unspoken words, of shared pain, of a deep and desperate yearning that he no longer had the strength to hide. Clara sat in the rocking chair on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the murmur of his voice and the restless turning of the woman in his bed. She finally understood. It wasn't that Wyatt didn't care for her, or respect her. In his own way, he did. But what he felt for May was something else entirely. It was a thing grown in the same soil, watered by the same tears, and hardened by the same merciless sun. They were two halves of a whole tragedy. His heart wasn't just occupied. It was scarred and grafted to another's. Perhaps, she thought with a clarity that was as cold and sharp as the night air. His heart had been split in two. One half was buried on the hill with Sarah and Thomas. The other half was lying in his bed, fighting for its life. There was nothing left for her. The fever broke just before dawn. May's breathing deepened, and the flush on her cheeks subsided. A sheen of sweat covered her skin. And Wyatt, his own face sagging with relief, gently wiped it away. He finally slumped back in his chair, his head falling back, his eyes closing in utter, bone-deep exhaustion. Clara watched the sun rise, painting the scorched earth in hues of pink and gold. A decision, terrible and clear, had formed in her heart. When May was awake and lucid, her stormy eyes still clouded with weakness. Clara brought her a cup of weak tea. Wyatt had finally succumbed to sleep in the chair by the bed. Clara sat on the edge of the mattress. The two women looked at each other in the quiet morning light. "He never left your side," Clara said softly. It was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. May looked at Wyatt's sleeping form, and a look of incredible pain and love crossed her face. "He shouldn't have," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Clara took a deep breath, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "May," she said, her voice steady, "I have to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. If I were to leave, if I were to let you stay, would he be happier?" May's eyes flew back to Clara's, wide with shock. Tears welled up, spilling onto her cheeks. She shook her head. "You don't understand. It could never be that simple." "It seems to me," Clara said, her heart aching with the truth of her own words, "that it's the only simple thing left in this whole complicated mess." 2 days later, May was strong enough to walk. Her clothes, washed and mended by Clara, were folded neatly on a chair. She was dressed, her face pale but resolved. Her intention was clear. She was going to walk out the door and back to her own ranch, restoring the order that Clara's question had so profoundly fractured. Wyatt stood by the fireplace, his back to the room, his shoulders rigid. Clara stood by the table. The air was thick with unspoken goodbyes. May walked to the door and put her hand on the latch. "Thank you," she said to the room at large, "for everything." Wyatt didn't turn. Clara's heart clenched. This was it, the moment of separation, the return to their lonely, ordered lives. But it felt wrong. It felt like a surrender. It felt like another loss, for all of them. "Wait," Clara said. May paused, her hand still on the door. "Stay," Clara said, the word surprising her as much as it did them. "Stay, for supper." Wyatt finally turned, his face a canvas of confusion. May looked at Clara, her eyes asking 1,000 questions. "The food is on the table," Clara said simply, gesturing to the pot of stew and the fresh bread she had laid out. "It would be a shame to waste it." Hesitantly, May let her hand fall from the door. She walked to the table. Wyatt, moving as if in a trance, took his usual seat. Clara sat down, and May, after a moment, took the third chair. For the first time, the three of them sat at the table together. The silence was deafening. The scrape of a spoon against a bowl was a cannon shot. They ate without looking at each other. The tension of fourth presence at the meal, it was awkward, unbearable. And then, through the open door, a meadowlark began to sing, its voice a cascade of clear, impossibly cheerful notes that spilled into the quiet room. It was such a simple, beautiful sound in the midst of their profound and complicated misery. And for some reason, it broke something in them. A small chuckle escaped Clara's lips. Wyatt looked up, a ghost of a smile touching his mouth. May met Clara's eyes, and a genuine, weary smile spread across her face. And then they were laughing. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of absurdity, of sheer, unadulterated release. They laughed until tears streamed down their faces, laughing at the bird, at themselves, at the utter impossibility of their lives. And in that moment of shared, helpless laughter, the tension shattered into a million pieces. Later that night, the house was quiet again, but it was a different quiet. The cold walls were gone. Clara lay in her bed, staring into the darkness, but she did not feel like a stranger. She felt a part of something she couldn't name. She thought of Wyatt, alone in his room, and May, given the guest bed, alone in hers. 3 solitary souls, adrift in the wreckage of their lives. She rose from her bed, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. She was not driven by jealousy or duty or anger. She was driven by a deep, elemental need, a need for warmth, for touch, for the simple, life-affirming solace of another human body, a need to feel alive in a place so defined by death. She walked down the short hall and stopped at Wyatt's door. It was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. He was standing by the window, a silhouette against the moonlight, looking out at the ruins of his barn. He turned as she entered, his face unreadable in the shadows. She didn't speak. She walked to him and placed her hands on his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was not a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of profound, desperate claiming. A kiss that said, "I am here, I am real, I am alive." For a moment, he was rigid with shock, and then, with a low groan that seemed to come from the depths of his being, he surrendered. His arms came around her, pulling her tight against him, his mouth answering hers with a hunger that matched her own. It was not a kiss of love. Not yet. It was a kiss of shared loneliness, of desperate need, a raw and beautiful collision of 2 people who refused to be ghosts any longer. The next morning, as the first light crept into the cabin, Clara slipped out of Wyatt's room. Her hair was down, her face flushed. As she stepped into the hallway, she found May standing there. She was holding a shawl, her expression one of deep, undisguised pain. She had heard, she knew. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Clara did not flinch or look away in shame. May did not retreat in anger. There was a silent, painful acknowledgement in their shared gaze. 1,000 things passed between them: hurt, acceptance, resignation, and a strange, nascent understanding. Nothing had been solved. In fact, everything had just become infinitely more complicated. The lines had been irrevocably blurred. They were no longer just neighbors, or rivals, or friends. They were something else now, something for which the world had no name. May did not leave that day, or the next. The unspoken decision to stay hung in the air, as tangible and unsettling as the smell of smoke that still clung to the timbers of the cabin. A fragile, terrifying new world was being built within those 4 walls, a world without a map. They moved around each other with a quiet, deliberate caution, each of them acutely aware of the new lines that had been drawn and the old ones that had been erased. The laughter by the supper table had broken the tension, but in its place was a profound and nerve-wracking uncertainty. This new arrangement could not remain a secret. The West was a land of vast distances, but the spaces between people were small, filled with observation and speculation. The mail rider, a lanky man named Silas, was the first to carry the tale. He noted May's horse still in the makeshift corral a week after the fire, saw 3 sets of clothes hanging on the line, and saw the 3 of them, Wyatt, Clara, and May, working together to clear the charred debris of the barn. His report in town was not malicious, merely factual, but it was a seed planted in fertile ground. The whispers began in the general store, a low hum of disapproval among the sacks of flour and barrels of nails. They grew louder at the Sunday church service, where the Thompsons' empty pew was a subject of more fervent prayer and speculation than the sermon itself. The story twisted and grew with each telling. It was no longer a story of a neighbor helping after a fire. It was a lurid tale of sin and impropriety. The mail-order bride, they said, was either a fool or a willing participant. The Blackwood widow, a predator who had finally sunk her claws into the grieving widower. And Wyatt Thompson, once an object of pity, was now a man of weak morals, living in open defiance of God and community. The full force of the town's judgment was unleashed on Clara. When she drove the wagon to Redemption for supplies, the chill was immediate. Women who had once offered her condescending smiles now turned their backs. Mrs. Gable, behind the counter of the general store, suddenly found herself unable to fill Clara's order. "I'm afraid we're fresh out of coffee, Mrs. Thompson," she said, her eyes fixed on a point just over Clara's shoulder, though a fresh crate of it was visible by the door. "And the flour shipment has been delayed." "I can see the coffee right there, Mrs. Gable," Clara said, her voice even. "My apologies. That crate is spoken for." The lie was as thin as a pane of glass, and just as cold. Clara stood her ground for a moment, the other customers in the store watching her, their faces a mixture of smugness and avid curiosity. She felt the blood rush to her cheeks, a hot tide of humiliation. She placed a few coins on the counter for the salt she held in her hand. "Keep the change," she said, and walked out, her back straight, her head held high, though she felt as if 1,000 needles were pricking her skin. The town had declared war, and she was on the front lines. The attacks on May were more direct, more cowardly. They came at night, a heavy rock thrown against her cabin door, the sound exploding in the quiet darkness. Vile words painted on her fence in crude, white letters. One night, a group of drunken cowboys rode by, firing their pistols into the air and shouting obscenities, their voices slurring threats and lewd suggestions. May met it all with a stoic, fortified silence, a rifle kept close by her side. But Clara could see the toll it was taking in the new, hard lines around her eyes, in the way she would startle at the sound of a horse approaching too fast. Wyatt bore the town's scorn like a physical burden. He was a man accustomed to solitude, but not to ostracism. When men he had known for years averted their gazes in the street, it was a blow. The final, official condemnation came from the most powerful man in Redemption, the Reverend Michael Davies. He arrived at the ranch one afternoon, his black coat a stark blot against the brown landscape, his face set in an expression of grim, righteous purpose. He refused to dismount, forcing Wyatt to meet him in the yard, a supplicant before a judge. Clara and May watched from the cabin window. "Thompson," the Reverend began, his voice booming with practiced authority, "I have come here as a servant of the Lord and a shepherd to this community. A community you are poisoning with your arrangement." Wyatt stood before him, his hands loose at his sides, his expression unreadable. "This is my land, Reverend." "It is God's land," Davies thundered, his horse shifting nervously beneath him. "And you are defiling it. You have taken a wife, a sacrament before God, and you have sullied your home with the presence of this other woman. The town is rife with rumor. You are a mockery. You are bringing shame and sin into our midst." "What happens on my property is my business," Wyatt said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Everything is the Lord's business," the Reverend shot back. "I am giving you a choice. Send the Blackwood woman away. Return to a life of decency. Beg forgiveness for your transgression, and perhaps this community can find it in its heart to forgive you as well. Or you will be cut off, utterly." He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes blazing with zeal. "Choose man, God, or Gomorrah." Wyatt looked from the preacher's furious face toward the cabin, where he knew two women were watching. His choice was not about God or Gomorrah. It was about the three of them. "I reckon you should get off my land now, Reverend," he said, his voice quiet but leaving no room for argument. The Reverend stared at him, aghast. "You have made your choice," he spat, his face contorted with fury. "May God have mercy on your damn souls." He wrenched his horse's head around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and condemnation in his wake. The isolation the preacher had promised descended swiftly. The next day, the sheriff rode out to inform Wyatt that his contract to provide remounts for the local patrol had been terminated. The reason given was budgetary concerns. But the truth was plain. The town was closing its doors. Their small ranch, once a part of the larger community, was now an island, surrounded by a sea of hostility. The weight of it all finally broke Wyatt. For weeks he had absorbed the scorn, the whispers, the economic blows, his anger a slow-burning fire in his gut. But the sight of Clara's humiliation and the fear in May's eyes eroded his resolve. One evening, after a week of relentless pressure, he sat at the table, staring at a stack of unpaid bills and a near-empty ledger. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "It's over," he said, his voice a dead flat thing. "He was right. We can't live here." Clara and May, who had been mending clothes by the fire, looked at him. "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "I mean, I'm selling the ranch," he said, not looking at them. "I'll take what I can get for it. We'll go somewhere else. Oregon, maybe California. Somewhere no one knows us. Somewhere we can start over." It was the voice of a defeated man. The man who had faced down loss, bandits, and the merciless land itself was now proposing to run from the whispers of small-minded people. May looked down at her hands, her expression one of profound sadness. She had run before, in her heart. She was prepared to run again if it meant peace for him. But Clara stood up. The fragile girl from the East was gone, and in her place was a woman forged in the fire of the last few months. "No," she said. Wyatt looked up, surprised. "Clara, you don't understand." "No, Wyatt, you don't understand," she said, her voice ringing with a strength he had never heard before. She came to the table and leaned on it, her eyes blazing. "Where would we go? Do you think there's some magical place over the mountains where people don't whisper, where they don't judge what they don't understand? They're the same everywhere. We run from this, and we'll be running for the rest of our lives." She looked from his face to May's. "I did not survive a trip across this country. I did not learn to milk a cow and mend a fence and fight a fire, just to be run off by the likes of Agnes Miller and Reverend Davies." Her voice softened, but lost none of its intensity. "This is our home. You built it. We saved it. Together. I am not leaving." She looked directly at Wyatt, her gaze unwavering. "We stay. We don't need anyone's permission to live our lives." Her words hung in the silent cabin, as powerful and definitive as a hammer striking an anvil. She had spoken a truth so fundamental that it shamed his despair. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the mail-order bride he had ordered, but a woman of incredible, surprising strength, a partner. He then looked at May, who was watching Clara with an expression of awe and dawning hope. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was different again. The despair had lifted, replaced by a quiet, defiant resolve. They sat before the hearth, the fire casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. The wind howled outside, a lonely sound, but inside, there was a feeling of sanctuary. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames. Then, Clara reached out. She didn't reach for Wyatt. She reached for May, who was sitting on a low stool beside her. She took May's hand, a hand that was, like her own, calloused from work and scarred by life. May's head snapped up in surprise, her stormy eyes wide. She looked at their joined hands, and then at Clara. Clara simply held her gaze and squeezed her hand gently. Wyatt watched them. He watched the firelight play on their faces, on Clara's fierce determination and May's astonished, dawning peace. He saw their linked hands, a simple, profound gesture of alliance, of acceptance, of love. A knot of emotion, thick and painful, rose in his throat. Everything he had felt, the grief for Sarah, the pull toward May, the growing respect and affection for Clara, it all coalesced in that one moment. It was not a choice between two women. It had never been. It was a choice between closing his heart forever or allowing it to find a new, strange, and beautiful shape. His eyes filled with tears. The first he had shed since he had buried his son. He didn't try to hide them. He let them fall, hot and silent, a baptism of grief and gratitude. This was his family. Not the one he had lost, not the one he had planned, but the one he had found in the ashes. Their love didn't fit into the neat boxes of the Reverend's world. It was a wild, stubborn thing, born of pain and survival. But it was real. It was the truest thing he had left. From that night on, the final walls came down. They began to live not as three separate people under one roof, but as a single, interwoven unit. The awkwardness of the first few days gave way to a new, unspoken rhythm. They shared everything, starting with the work. Wyatt no longer saw it as his ranch, but theirs. May, with her deep knowledge of the land, worked alongside him, her strength and competence a perfect match for his. Clara, with her quiet organization, took charge of the cabin, the garden, and the finances, creating a world of order and comfort that had been missing. The divisions of labor blurred into a shared effort. They rebuilt the barn together, a testament in new wood and sweat to their collective will. They moved May's few possessions from her now abandoned cabin, officially merging their two solitary worlds into one. The sharing extended beyond work. They shared meals filled with easy conversation and laughter. They shared stories of their pasts, filling in the empty spaces, weaving their separate histories into a single, complex tapestry. They shared their fears in the dead of night and their small hopes in the morning light. They were creating their own society, their own rules, their own definition of home. And in the deep, quiet nights of the West, with the wind whispering secrets around the corners of the cabin and the vast, starry sky stretching to infinity, they shared themselves. It began not with a plan, but as a natural extension of their shared lives. It was born of a need for comfort, for the profound solace that can only be found in human touch. One night, it might be Wyatt's arms around Clara, a continuation of the desperate need that had first brought them together. Another night, it might be Clara and May sitting by the fire, a comforting hand on a shoulder turning into a shared embrace, a deep understanding that went beyond words. And some nights, the lines blurred completely, a tangle of limbs and shared warmth in the darkness, a braid of three strands, each one making the others stronger. It was a geography of scars and solace, a quiet, desperate, and beautiful act of claiming life and warmth in a world that had offered them so much coldness and death. They had found in each other not a replacement for what they had lost, but a new and revolutionary way to be whole. The seasons turned, and their island of a ranch found its own rhythm, its own self-sustaining peace. They were an entity unto themselves, a family forged not by law or convention, but by fire and will. They were pariahs, but they were free. The town of redemption, with its judgment and its piety, might as well have been on the other side of the world, but the world has a way of reminding you that you are a part of it, whether you wish to be or not. The reminder came with the wind. It was a hot, dry autumn, the kind that made the whole world feel like tinder. For weeks, a relentless wind blew from the south, carrying the scent of dust and distant prairies. It frayed the nerves and whipped the red dirt into stinging clouds. It was on a night like this, when the wind moaned around the corners of the cabin like a grieving spirit, that they saw the sky to the north begin to glow, not the gentle glow of a rising moon, but a malevolent, pulsing orange that painted the undersides of the clouds in shades of blood and fire. "Town," Wyatt said, his voice flat and hard as he stood on the porch, staring at the angry horizon. "The wind is carrying it right through the center of it." Clara and May stood beside him, the same grim understanding on their faces. The wind that had been their tormentor was now fanning the flames of a potential catastrophe for the very people who had scorned them. For a long moment, they just watched. It would have been easy to do nothing. It would have been just, some might say, to let the town reap the whirlwind of its own hypocrisy. But the habit of survival runs deeper than resentment. The instinct to fight a fire, any fire, was etched into their bones. They had fought one to save their own home. They could not stand by and watch another burn. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. Wyatt turned and headed for the new barn to saddle the horses. May went inside to grab the heavy canvas water bags. Clara gathered blankets and the small medical kit she kept, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency that would have shocked the women of Redemption. The ride into town was a journey into hell. The air grew thick with smoke, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. Embers, like angry orange fireflies, whipped past them in the dark. As they neared the edge of town, the roar of the fire was a living thing, a hungry beast devouring the dry, wooden buildings. The center of the blaze was the livery stable, its massive stores of hay acting as a furnace, and the merciless wind was driving the flames directly toward the main street, where the general store, the saloon, and the small clapboard houses of the townspeople stood. Chaos reigned. People ran screaming through the streets, their figures silhouetted against the flames. Some were trying to form a disorganized bucket brigade from the town well, but their efforts were pitiful against the inferno. Others were simply trying to save what possessions they could, their faces masks of panic and despair. Wyatt, Clara, and May rode into the maelstrom not as outcasts, but as a disciplined force. Their own fire had been a brutal teacher. "May, the rooftops!" Wyatt yelled over the roar. "If we can keep them wet, we can stop it from jumping the street." "Clara, the well!" May commanded, her voice cutting through the panic. "Organize the brigade, short, fast lines. Don't let them waste a drop." Clara, without hesitation, slid from her horse and ran toward the frantic cluster of people at the well. "Form 2 lines!" she shouted, her voice imbued with an authority that made people stop and listen. "1 to pass the full buckets, 1 to pass back the empty. Move!" To their own surprise, the panicked citizens of Redemption obeyed the mail-order bride. They saw not an object of their gossip, but a beacon of calm in the chaos. Meanwhile, Wyatt and May were a whirlwind of focused action. They soaked the blankets Clara had brought and, with a strength and agility that stunned the onlookers, scaled the side of the mercantile building. They moved across the pitched rooftops like wraiths in the smoke, beating out embers, dousing the hot, smoking shingles with the precious water from the canvas bags. They worked in a seamless, unspoken partnership, each anticipating the other's move, their shared purpose a silent language. A scream cut through the din. The roof of the small house next to the livery had caught, and a section of it collapsed inward. A woman, Agnes Miller, stood in the street, her face a mask of horror. "My husband, Samuel, is still inside." Before anyone could stop him, Wyatt leaped from the roof of the mercantile to the porch of the burning house. He kicked in the door and disappeared into the roiling smoke and heat. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The Reverend Davies, who had been leading a loud but ineffective prayer circle, fell silent, his face pale. May was right behind him. She didn't go in the front. She ran to the side of the house, smashing a window with the butt of the rifle she'd brought. "Samuel!" she screamed into the inferno. "Where are you?" A weak cough answered from within. Moments later, Wyatt emerged from the doorway, half carrying, half dragging the large, soot-blackened form of Samuel Miller. The man was alive, but barely. just as they cleared the porch. The rest of the roof gave way with a deafening crash, sending a fountain of sparks and flames into the night sky. They fought the fire for 3 hours. They fought it until their muscles screamed, their lungs burned, and their faces were coated in a thick, black grime. They fought alongside the very men who had turned their backs on them, their shared sweat and desperation erasing the lines of animosity. When the wind finally died down and the fire was brought under control, leaving a smoldering, blackened scar through the heart of the town, the three of them stood leaning against the town well, utterly exhausted. The people of Redemption looked at them. They saw their blistered hands, their weary bodies, the raw courage that had saved their homes and their lives. They looked at Wyatt, who had pulled a man from a fiery death. They looked at May, whose quick thinking had saved the main street. They looked at Clara, who had turned their panic into an effective force, and in their eyes, for the first time, there was no judgment. There was only a quiet, grudging, and profound respect. No one offered a formal apology. Words were not the way of the West, but the change was palpable. The next time Clara went to the general store, a recovering Samuel Miller insisted she go to the front of the line, Mrs. Gable found she had an ample supply of coffee, and she pressed a bag of sweets into Clara's hand, muttering, "For the trouble." The sheriff stopped Wyatt in the street, not to serve a notice, but to clap him on the shoulder and say, "That was a damn fine thing you did, Thompson." The women still whispered, but now their whispers were of awe, not scorn. The town had not come to understand their life, but they had come to respect their character. And in that harsh land, character was the only currency that truly mattered. A year passed. The barn was rebuilt, stronger than before. The town slowly healed its wounds, and on the ranch, the quiet, revolutionary life of its 3 inhabitants deepened, settling into a rhythm of shared work, shared meals, and shared love. One bright summer morning, on the anniversary of the day they had decided to stay, they walked down to the small, cottonwood-lined creek that marked the edge of their property. There was no preacher, no audience. There was only the 3 of them, the clear, bubbling water, and the vast, silent sky. Wyatt took a hand of each woman in his. He looked at Clara, at the woman whose quiet strength had been the anchor that stopped them from drifting apart. He looked at May, at the woman whose shared pain had been the mirror to his own soul. His heart was so full of a love so expansive and unconventional that it felt it might burst. "I lost everything once," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought a man only gets one life, one family. You've shown me that's not true. You've taught me that a home isn't just a place you build with wood. It's a place you build with courage." Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "We built it together." "And we'll keep it together," May added, her voice soft but firm. They stood there, hands linked, a trinity against the endless landscape. Wyatt looked at them both, his gaze a solemn vow. "No one gets left behind again," he said. It was the only promise that mattered. It was their creed, their covenant, their prayer. They sealed it not with a ring, but with a long, quiet look of absolute understanding that passed between the 3 of them. Life continued, now rooted in that promise, and life, where it is nurtured, creates more life. It was Clara who realized it first, a subtle change in her body, a new tenderness, a weariness that was different from the exhaustion of hard work. She told them one evening on the porch. Wyatt, who had been oiling a saddle, went completely still. May, who was mending a shirt, dropped her needle. Clara watched their faces in the fading light, her heart pounding. Wyatt came to her, kneeling before her chair. He placed a hand, so gently, on her stomach. His face was a mask of disbelief, of terror, and of a hope so fierce it was painful to see. "Clara?" he whispered. "Yes," she breathed, tears welling in her eyes. May came and knelt beside him, placing her hand over his. She looked at Clara, her stormy eyes soft with a profound, shared joy. "A baby," she said, her voice full of wonder. "A new life." In that moment, there was no jealousy, no complexity, only the simple, overwhelming miracle of it. The child was not just Clara's and Wyatt's. It was theirs, a child of their unconventional, courageous love. The months that followed were filled with a gentle, protective anticipation. Wyatt treated Clara as if she were made of the most delicate glass, his gruff tenderness a constant presence. But it was May who was her rock, May, who had been through this before, who knew the fears and the changes. She guided Clara with a quiet wisdom, her hands gentle, her knowledge a comfort. She was not a rival or a helper. She was a partner in the act of creation. When the time came, it was a long and difficult labor. The winter winds howled outside, a reminder of the harshness of the world. But inside the cabin, there was only a sacred, focused warmth. May was the midwife, her hands sure and steady, her voice a constant, calming murmur. Wyatt never left them. He sat behind Clara, his body a rock for her to lean against, his hands gripping hers and May's, his strength flowing into them both. He was a link in the chain, a silent, powerful presence connecting the two women, connecting the past to the future. And in the darkest hour of the night, a new cry filled the cabin, strong, healthy, and full of life. It was a girl. They lay together afterwards, exhausted and triumphant. Clara held the small, warm bundle in her arms. May sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting on Clara's shoulder, and Wyatt sat in the chair beside them, his gaze moving between his daughter and the two women he loved, his face streaked with tears of a joy he never thought he would know again. They named her Hope. The nights that followed were long, but they were no longer filled with fear or loneliness. They would sit on the porch, the three of them, a new, stronger family, passing the sleeping infant back and forth. They would watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant, fiery strokes. And they no longer saw a reminder of their isolation. They saw the beauty of their world, a world they had built for themselves, against all odds. The silence was not empty. It was full of peace. The story doesn't end in a grand, dramatic moment. It ends in a series of quiet, beautiful ones. It ends on a late afternoon, with the low sun casting long shadows across the land. The three of them ride out together, their horses moving at an easy pace. Wyatt rides in the middle, his shoulders broad and relaxed. May is on his right, her black hair in a long braid, her seat in the saddle as natural as breathing. And on his left is Clara, her copper hair catching the golden light and cradled safely in her arms, wrapped in a warm blanket, is the future. They ride out across the plains, not into the sunset, but with it, three figures moving as one. They are a family, heading home, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest, most unforgiving of lands, love, in all its wild and unpredictable forms, will find a way to grow. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this, and please share your thoughts on the journey of Wyatt, Clara, and May.